a time, the humans of Sera knew the illusion of peace until Emergence Day. In time, their valiant defense was crushed. With billions dead, humans denied their enemy control by destroying their own civilization. Now, the long struggle against overwhelming odds approaches a final, desperate stand.
Gears of War is a gripping, blockbuster-esque, adrenaline-fueled video game that plunges players into a dystopian world teetering on the brink of destruction. Set on the war-torn planet of Sera, it follows the harrowing struggle between humanity and the Locust Horde, a monstrous regime that fights with no quit whatsoever, invading from what the game will come to recognize as emergence holes. The game's atmosphere is defined by its gritty, desolate landscapes, punctuated by crumbling cities and battle-scarred terrain that would soon enough become its own staple in the series one way or another. This was an idea the developers over at Epic Games had from the get-go, however, often saying they really wanted to focus on environmental details and help make the game flourish in as many ways as possible.
It's currently like the #1 anticipated title for 2006.
We thought it would be really interesting. The military's got these little directional speakers that they've actually been dropping in places like Iraq. So imagine you're standing on the platform of a subway station in that's New York City or the Tube or whatever, and we just make sounds come out of the subway tunnel.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yes, you heard me right. The developers of the most kid-friendly, popular game on the market right now got their start, so to speak, with this gruesome, chainsaw-wielding, mature title that managed to spark an entire franchise in the coming years. Rather than battling it out in a 100-player mosh pit to the doom, in this game, players assume the roles of hard-earned soldiers, also known as Gears, equipped with powerful weaponry and clad in fierce, formidable armor as they engage in intense, tactical combat against the relentless Locust forces, all in the name of humanity's last stand. The game's narrative is just as compelling as its action sequences, weaving a tale of sacrifice, camaraderie, and resilience amidst the foggy chaos of war. With its innovative cover-based mechanics, stunning visuals, and immersive storytelling, to this day I think Gears of War stands on its own as an icon and thrilling experience in the realm of gaming. Gears isn't afraid to use basic figure-of-speech themes like action and sci-fi in order to drive in its genuinely prestigious story, while also making enough room to have it be told through a thoughtful lens scattered alongside sections, or barrages rather, of endless gunfire and gory explosions. But at its core, one could even make the argument that Gears is about family, honor, and brotherhood and all that jazz, and still get some brownie points. Needless to say, Gears of War has undoubtedly carved its bold initials into the tree of gaming, and they've managed to remain there, as brash as ever for years now. One of the hardest parts about starting this video was finding a good and thoughtfully written way to introduce someone who has never played a Gears game to the overall franchise as a whole. And I've gotta say, I've struggled significantly with that task over the past few months. It's honestly just hard as fuck to illustrate on paper all of the little things that come together and mesh to make a Gears of War game feel the way it does. For instance, Epic's lead programmer at the time, Lee Perry, had this to say about working with Cliff Bleszinski, the lead designer for the first 3 installments of the franchise. Quote, "Working super close with Cliff for years now, I don't think many people can recognize his true talent. He's able to pick up a controller for a game, and he really gets the small details that make it feel good and interesting, to determine what good feedback is. He can really hit the nail on the button with specifics like, hey, I wish there was a quarter-second lag here when this happened, and the camera should jerk. When the player hits a wall, we should change the field of view on the camera and tighten this up. And we really need to put a particle effect here when you slam into cover to solidify you're hitting it. End quote. These few sentences alone should do a good enough job of demonstrating how many little things come together to make the game flow and feel as good as it does. Meanwhile, without going as far as stressing those notions to you at any time during a playthrough. I mean, seriously, I had to look under rocks and dust off bookshelves to find that quote from the developers. And if it wasn't for the developer-authorized retrospective book written by Arthur Gies, I would have never found out any of this information. This book is a solid peek behind the scenes and documents most, if not all, there is to know about the first 4 Gears of War games. I highly recommend it to anyone who is even mildly interested in the Gears of War saga. You can learn the history of the games through the words of its very own developers, designers, and artists, accompanied by key visuals, photography, concept art, and so much more that, the book is like 300 pages. It is, without a doubt, the most comprehensive guide to a franchise that I have ever had the pleasure of reading personally with my own 2 eyes. So, after giving the book all of that praise, I feel like it's only right and fair in my mind to give credit to the actual person who recommended it, fellow YouTuber and respected writer Noah Gervais. He brung this up in the first place in his very own campaign retrospective about Gears of War. Without him mentioning this book in his video, I would have never found it, I don't think, so I genuinely can't thank him enough for that, even if all he did was just list it as a reference here and there. Now, with that said, if you finish this stupidly long video and you're still in the mood for some Gears content, you can watch his extremely well-written retrospective that focuses on the campaign mainly. I'll have it linked below. When I finally set out and decided to take the time out of my day to start writing this retrospective, I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to make one my way, and focus on other essential game modes the franchise has to offer, like multiplayer and eventually Horde mode. Even if I do not have the most legendary multiplayer stories, or popular clips, or incredible stat lines when it comes to Gears of War multiplayer, I have a few, and that's enough for me to yap about it. Because not only is it important for the history of the franchise, but these modes have also come to garner tons of respect from the community over the years. And all of it wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the overwhelming success and great feedback Epic received with Gears of War's multiplayer all the way back in 2006. Which is an obvious statement itself, but if you're aware of the behind-the-scenes context, you'd know how amazing it is that we even got to see multiplayer at all, considering this game mode was almost scrapped entirely due to development frustrations at the time. Even this version of the game that was released originally back in 2006 still stands firm and stout today thanks to Xbox backwards compatibility. Yes, I'm aware of the Ultimate Edition remaster, and I'll speak on that eventually, but like I was saying, even to this very day, the original Xbox 360 release copy still manages to hold up to some modern-day gaming standards. I mean, hell, the game damn near revolutionized and set new standards for shooting mechanics in third-person games, arguably. If you were to take a glance back into the gaming world circa 2006, you won't be able to find very many games around at the time that had successfully implemented a good and comfortable shooting system for a player to work with, using GTA 3 and Saints Row 1 mainly for examples here. Now, don't get it twisted, I'm not shitting on these games by any standard, because these are honest-to-God great works of gaming art, but when it comes to the shooting parts of these games, they tend to lack substance here and there and feel a little dated on that aspect, you have to admit. One game that came onto the market and had some pretty good shooting mechanics from the get-go, however, was Capcom's very own 2005 hit, Resident Evil 4. A game that set a few standards of its own in the horror field of gaming, and got its very own bona fide remake in 2023. You see, back over at the Epic Studios, Cliff and a few of the other guys got their hands on some very, very early alpha footage of it before the game had officially released, and became instantly fascinated with the game's design choices. Mainly stuff like having the camera so close to the player's back. Perry and a few other devs often refer to this as second person. They really got a kick of having the player be the main center focus of the screen, and kind of having the environment hanging out in the background, doing its own thing. The main thing that caught Epic's eye really, though, and the rest of the world, I guess you could say, was the horror aspect of Resident Evil over everything else. Not only is it a zombie game, of course, but you see, in Resident Evil 4, enemies take a ridiculous number of bullets to kill. This helps add to the horror by inadvertently making it harder to keep them away from you, and at the same time causes you, the player, to play more conservatively with ammunition, and encourages you to be more tactical when navigating a new area. All of the above also suggests the player should be more accurate with their gunfire, especially in multiplayer modes. And I'm not really too sure how to explain it, but when a game uses tiny details like that to come together to encourage you, the player, to be better without going as out of their way to, put it in your face, that's just something I can really get behind, man. Speaking more about tiny details that come together to make an icon, though, I knew it was only a matter of time before I brung up the Lancer, but honestly, I didn't expect it to be after 1100 words in. Ah, yes, the Lancer. Most people can recognize it as the gun with the comically large chainsaw bayonet that appears in all the promotional art and advertisements. If you could believe it or not, this gun was one of the very first things brought up by Cliff when he was pitching the whole idea of Gears of War to everyone over at Epic in the first place.
Hey, good job.
How are you, man?
When you do those live demos, I guess you really gotta stay with the aliens or you'll look bad.
Did you hear the sound and everything?
Oh yeah,
It's just
fantastic.
like boom, that's like the bass, and then it's crunchy, and I labored over that assault rifle sound with the sound designer. We're like, it's gotta be pop, it's gotta pop.
I love that chainsaw.
I had to fight for that. I had to fight for it, man. But it's a chocolate and a peanut butter for me, right? It's a gun with a chainsaw, right? So it works out really well. So
How's it look for shipping this fall?
He even went as far as to say this, quote, "A machine gun with a chainsaw, that's a real chocolate and peanut butter situation right there." I really wanted to make a chainsaw gun. I had designs of it for years, and I never actually got around to it. Eventually I said, you know what, I want to see this gun in a video game. I remember having the meeting with Jerry O'Flattery and Chris Perna, and all the folks over there, and they asked, is this gonna be our thing? And I'm like, fuck yeah. Jay Hawkins did the original design of the gun, and it looked awesome. But it made absolutely no sense because in the heat of combat, you'd accidentally cut off your fucking hand. End quote. Now, I debated a lot with myself over whether I should include that quote or not. But then I realized that you really kind of need every little piece of insider knowledge describing the little things that comprise the Lancer in order to truly understand how unique this gun is and what makes it stand out compared to other iconic guns in different video games. Starting things off with the more direct of attachments, this high-definition assault rifle is equipped with an unparalleled chainsaw model, placed where a foregrip on a normal gun would be, meaning the weapon itself is capable of being effective at medium to long range, and pretty damn grisly when an enemy wanders into shorter melee distance. Lancer executions were designed to be a unique sight, to say the least. Epic primarily wanted to put the power in the player's hand, so to speak, allowing them to use in-game mechanics to their advantage, unlike many other shooters at the time where domination moves were mainly player improvised. Kinda like teabagging in the Halo series. Rather than copying what was already working at the time, Gears of War took a more direct approach and built them into the game with over-the-top chainsaw kills and curb stomping. And I have to admit, they are really grotesque at times. The camera even leans into the perfect shot to further establish the bizarre sequence of cutting some fucker in half. But the actual chainsawing is only half the sport when it comes to the Lancer. It also stands true as one of the most accurate guns in the game, maybe even across the entire franchise, I'm not too sure. The first bullet fired out of this handheld behemoth sends out a large, bass-riddled blast followed by a continuous crunchy bombardment for however long you decide to hold down the trigger. And plus, the countless hours the devs spent tinkering with the sound design also play a huge part and do a great job of making this rifle sound larger than life at times, but it's not the only thing at motion here. Everything I mentioned above combines effortlessly with the clever reloading minigame, a function that makes the Lancer, and most guns in the game, feel more engaging and allows battles to feel more player-orientated based on how well you can manage your gunfire. When the player attempts reloading, a transparent meter appears in the top right corner with two colored lines at different sections depending on the weapon. If you can hit the gray part of the bar, you can successfully speed up the time of your reload, allowing for seemingly endless combat sequences. If you can hit the white part of the bar, on the other hand, not only do you speed up the process, but you get a small damage boost applied to your bullet damage. This is referred to as an active reload. When this happens, the damage per shot is also increased by around 8% for all ammunition returned to the weapon. The shots that have increased damage are shown as flashing in the ammo meter. This was a mechanic the community really enjoyed and quickly gained popularity in multiplayer modes especially. Gears multiplayer is quite hard for someone like me to discuss because I personally do not have the most experience in that field of play. But it doesn't change the fact that the game mode was beloved to a decent community of gamers once upon a time. I think one of the main contributing reasons I always thought Gears was such a special collective was because not very many notable Gears of War clones ever really sprung up with ambition to rival Epic anywhere down the line of development during the entire franchise. Meaning one could say with full confidence that the feeling one gets when embarking into Gears multiplayer has remained unequaled throughout the years and unparalleled by any other video game. Blasting all the way back to the early days of development for Gears of War, however, it would turn out that things were not always as clear-cut as Epic Games made them seem in their Race to E3 documentary that aired on MTV. Long before the concept of chainsaw guns and bulky brick shithouse dudes, Epic worked on a series of games titled Unreal Tournament. These games came in many shapes and sizes, but at their core they were designed to be fun multiplayer shooters, which for the late 90s to early 2000s was innovative for the time and quickly gained notoriety. And I only bring this up because Epic didn't want to just copy and paste their already massively successful multiplayer components that are reliable and put them into a new franchise. Instead, Epic wanted to tackle a new kind of beast and test their game design skills by giving the player a whole new next-generation multiplayer experience. And by enduring that development hardship, they were able to discover cover-based mechanics really helped make that possibility into a reality, eventually granting them enough footroom to stand up beside household names like Halo. With corridor shooter games like Doom, Call of Duty, Quake, and even Halo, most eliminations can come from reaction-based combat, and reloading is most, if not often, a time of weakness. But for Gears, with each different painstakingly crafted gameplay mechanic working together, combined with the cover system mentioned previously, all of a sudden it began to play a lot differently than any other notable game before. Being just different enough to remain firm, and built true enough to still have players supporting and making content around it in 2024, almost 18 years down the road at the time of recording this. One of the first maps Epic developed for Gears of War was a dilapidated parking lot type area that was later renamed Gridlock. Epic basically decided whether or not to cut or keep multiplayer in the final game based on how many people enjoyed this map at the E3 2006 showcase.
I'm hoping everything's been pulled together for this final playtest. A lot of the things that were broken were relatively easy fixes, but as I've said before, game development's a house of cards. Change one thing, change everything. It's either going to go great and we're going to be able to play it, or it's going to be a total cluster. Ow, ow, that's my...
I'm in Marcus or Mike's seat, so...
I got one shot left to Rod.
Chainsaw user.
Guys, you gotta be able to use the shotgun when you're in close. Like, that's really annoying.
At E3, I would rather have journalists use the chainsaw too much than not enough.
Many online games at the time, like Halo, were becoming more popular and gaining traction, thanks to their unique, fun modes designed to keep players intrigued and hopefully playing for a very long time. Gears developers knew this was an area they couldn't be found lacking in, so they included 4 fast, fun, and tactical game modes that stayed true to the series for years to come, with the Ultimate Edition even adding a few new ones to spice things up. Warzone, Assassination, Execution, and Annex remained relatively popular throughout the Gears series, apart from Annex later being retitled to King of the Hill. At their foundation, though, the modes stayed strong and consistent enough to even act as a foundation for a well-formed esports scene once upon a time. A lot of really cool YouTube channels also hatched from this thriving community as well, some of which will most likely be featured in this segment of the video, and if not, then you probably already know about them either way. Eventually, everybody back at Epic was granted another year of development time by their publisher, Microsoft, and with this bonus time, Epic wasted no time completely remodeling the game's campaign, making it entirely 2-player co-op. Co-op quickly became an important focus point for the game and its future as a franchise. Rod Ferguson was brought onto the project after quitting his job at Microsoft in order to work full-time at Epic Games as executive producer. When Rod was asked about co-op in video games and how it affected Gears, he had this to say, quote, "At the time, if you go back to 2005, 2006, and take a look at a bunch of games that released, the idea that co-op in video games was a cuttable feature was really, really prominent. A game would be announced with co-op, the fire gets turned up, they go into the church, and the first thing that gets cut would be co-op. And so, that was one of the things we decided to take on." Blazinski later echoed this sentiment by adding this to it. "You know, every Halo game I played through was with my wife in co-op. Let's actually make co-op a thing. To defeat the Covenant, to defeat the Flood, or the Locust together." End quote. Rod has also gone on record to say that he believes the games are best played as a shared experience, and I couldn't agree with him more honestly. Don't get it twisted, the games do allow you to play through them 100% completely solo without any consequences. But I, for one, do think it is more fun when you and your buddy are discussing which tactics work best to wipe out a whole sidewalk full of bad guys. I was lucky enough to have the pleasure of playing the first 3 Gears games all the way through with someone I love dearly that is no longer with us. As sad as that is, though, I'll never forget the great memories we made along our journey, nor will I stop appreciating the time they took out of their day and spent experiencing it all with me. We weren't alone in our endeavors, however, because, as it turns out, more than 1/3 of all Gears of War players would venture out into that desolate prison yard and complete at least one act of the game in co-op with a buddy. Although cooperative play would go on to be received as a massive success later on, this function also stressed out a lot of other aspects early on when it came to designing the full game. Having co-op in the final game meant everything about the main characters had to be accounted for when making decisions about their design, backstory, and personalities, because nobody is going to keep playing the game if they hate the protagonists they're stuck with for a few hours. The first main character the players get to see for themselves is an imprisoned Marcus Phoenix, voiced by John DiMaggio. That's the voice actor of Jake the Dog in Adventure Time, and Bender from the Futurama catalog for anyone unfamiliar. Marcus himself, though, was designed with the thought of players projecting themselves onto him, so he acts just as stoic as much as he does like Player 1. Marcus is undoubtedly the most stoic member in the main cast. acting as if he alone was sentenced to carry the burden of the entire world on his shoulders. And that wasn't necessarily on accident. His personality arose from the desire to embrace the reluctant hero archetype, very different from the more commercial heroes of first-person shooters, World War II patriots, and the Save the Princess platform mascots of gaming at the time. Instead, what the devs really wanted when thinking of a main character was a sort of anti-hero type persona. A type that didn't believe in the system, the cog, but he did believe in the overarching purpose, the idea of saving humanity. And he was good at it. Marcus was a cog soldier, a gear, a long time ago. But something he did left him in the position we see him in today, rotting away in that rusty prison cell. There's a spot later in the act that has you make your way through the House of Sovereigns, and Marcus's trial is teased, but as far as lore drops go, that's all we get for Gears 1. That is until Dom Santiago, voiced by Carlos Ferro, comes along and makes his very own introduction as Player 2. Meanwhile, Marcus is a badass anti-hero stoic. Dom, on the other hand, was designed to be the voice of the player. When some really crazy shit tends to happen, or you see some really ugly fucking monster, Dom is usually the first one out of the duo to say something like, "What the hell was that, man?" while Marcus keeps a straight face and silent tone. Dom also happens to be the more grounded character out of the bunch. It doesn't truly get much screen time during the hours of the first campaign, but it does hint here and there that Dom has a family and is searching for them with every bit of fight he has in him. And for what it's worth, it actually does blossom into a pretty decent story arc eventually down the line. But for now, all the players need to know is Dom is Marcus's childhood best friend, and more importantly, as of the moment currently, he is here to bust him out of the slab so he can rejoin the cog and attempt to save humanity. During the course of Marcus's imprisonment, the war had gotten so out of control that high-ranking military general Colonel Hoffman pardoned everyone. So when Dom is busting Marcus out and reintroducing him to the new battle-scarred world, it also coincides with introducing the players to the in-game world as well, alongside a tutorial. No matter what option you choose though, you're stuck with the Hammerburst assault rifle. In this game, the gun fires a strong, heavy-hitting spray of bullets in a burst pattern, hinting towards the name. More importantly though, this is the gun that most of the Locust Onslaught tend to use as their primary weapon, hint against you. So this is your chance to understand how the gun works so you can adjust your playstyle around it accordingly. Eventually, players will fight their way through the prison yard and board a King Raven. During the chopper ride, an iconic soldier by the name of Anthony Carmine asks Marcus about a mission he was on back in the day called Ashfo Fields. This is important in more ways than one. The first reason is the vagueness of the question. At this point in the game, no new player would be familiar with what they're referring to, leaving them puzzled for a second, and the craziest part is, that's exactly what they wanted them to think. Epic Games, deliberately casting a net of curiosity through psychological means. In the official book, some developers state that the actual story for Gears of War was one of the last things thought about when working on the game altogether. Lee Perry had this to say, quote, "We had maybe 14 or so of these levels that were kind of roughed in. Hey, we want this train level, maybe we want this haunted factory level, etc. We didn't know how they would interact with each other necessarily because none of us were big on the narrative side." End quote. So while they were carefully crafting the story, they decided somewhere along the line to add these little plot points often referred to as negative spaces that allowed the developers to kind of leave things be for now, but pick them up later if they wanted to. And this remains a signature storytelling tool throughout the entire mainline games and all the spin-offs. Ashfo Fields eventually got its own callback as a neat prologue chapter in Gears 4, and again before that as a book written by Karen Travis, but that didn't happen until around the third game in the franchise was about to release. I find this kind of storytelling very thought-provoking because it essentially adds more layers onto things, like a storyline similar to Star Wars would attempt, without actually going out of their way to shove it in your face, like stated before. While playing through this sequence again after listening to the Ashfo Fields audiobook, it adds a whole lot more weight to this conversation I never knew existed, and I can't recommend it enough to any Gears fan who hasn't done the same. Essentially, though, you get the gist that Marcus has made somewhat of a name for himself inside the COG. This almost immediately gets echoed with another interaction between him and Colonel Hoffman. Hoffman is depicted as a hardcore, strict as they come, and stern as fuck military big shot that only speaks to you in orders or screams. Kinda like a colonel would, I suppose. And not only is he one of my favorite characters in the entire franchise, but he also gets used as another storytelling tool here. In his first interaction with you on screen, he goes as far as to label you a traitor, while deeming you unworthy to even wear the same uniform as him. Meaning he's got to have some knowledge of your imprisonment, and based on this reaction, the player is led to believe that Marcus has truly done something heinous and worthful of punishment. Meanwhile, all of this is going on, Marcus gets a chance to lock eyes with a certain Lieutenant Anya Stroud, just before a counterattack gets sprung on them. She's going to be filling the role that Cortana would play in the Halo games. That being, feeding you intel through an earpiece while you survey the level and take out the bad guys. So the devs thought now is as good a time as any to show her to the audience, and sprinkle in a little bit of lore as well. It goes without saying that nobody would really give a fuck about a voice in your head that is telling you what to do constantly. But by actually showcasing Anya and making her glance at Marcus, it completely eradicates that issue, and it gives more of an incentive for you to care about her as a character, all while doing the more important part, arguably, by giving you a face to put behind the voice you'll be hearing for 70% of the game. That awkward glance wasn't for nothing either, as this is the devs trying their hardest to hint at the fact that these two have history between each other. History that will be adapted as the overarching story progresses through the multiple games. Now, I understand the devs are trying to tell a story here, and they did a wonderful job for the most part, but some scenes like this just come across as being over the top and more ambitious than anything else, and end up flying over any casual player's head 9 times out of 10 anyway. With that being said, however, that's probably the worst part of this whole act, because for the rest of it, you'll be fighting big ugly-headed grubs through some of the most downright uncanny edifices and structures I've ever seen in a video game. Everywhere you go is a destroyed and mangled part of what once was a beautiful, strong, and thriving civilization. Act 1 starts off by showcasing many things, but it's mainly here to set up the extraordinarily lovable cast. After advancing a little through the mission, you get a new objective to rescue Alpha Squad while also looking for the Resonator. During this costly mission, you do unfortunately lose some members of your squad. While regrouping with your teammates, Anthony Carmine gets a little antsy claiming his gun jammed, and gets straight up taken out like JFK right in front of you. And to make things worse, after you deal with the oncoming attackers, the radios are down, so you can't even report Carmine's death to Control. The only person that pays any kind of respect to him is Dom for a brief second. And now that I think about it, we didn't really get a whole lot of time to spend with Carmine before he met his demise, and yet he still managed to leave a huge impact on the community and fanbase. You gotta give credit to good writing, I suppose. I think one of the main reasons this was able to happen is the unfairness around his death. I mean, getting killed in the middle of reloading is so tragic, right? I'm sure if he could have managed to get a few shots off here or a few more bullets in the chamber, things would have been a whole lot different, right? But that's how war is, unfortunately. Foot soldiers don't get to pick the rules or set the standards in which they fight. They just have to be brave enough to operate efficiently, each one like an individual cog in the oily machine of war itself. One person slacking off is enough to throw the whole machine off course. Carmine's death managed to impact players in more ways than one, because now all we can do is continue pushing forward so that hopefully we have one day long enough to even remember him at all. Needless to say, he will be missed, but his death does open opportunity for another star personality to respectfully take his place in Delta Squad. Augustus Cole, or the Cole Train, most people know him as, voiced by Lester Spite, is another all-star on this roster of significant characters in the Gears universe, and a redoubtable member of Alpha Squad. Cole is the character designed with giving the players permission to enjoy what they're doing in mind. He has a sort of distinct charisma that cuts through all the darkness and grimy atmosphere that you're in. You're literally fighting genocidal monsters in a post-apocalyptic world for the future of humanity, and just as all seems lost, you hear Cole's distant "woo" in the background, and it comes across like a reassurance of some kind that everything will be okay. Cole was a former professional thrashball player plus celebrity before the Locust War, until he and pretty much everybody else got drafted just like you into the COG as a last-ditch effort because things got that serious. Cole is an athlete, a brash soldier, and his charisma is a nice spice that blends in surprisingly well to form his personality. Something I happened to pick up on with my recent playthroughs of the series is how often Cole makes references or callbacks to sports scenarios and plays. I guess whenever I was younger, I just wasn't too familiar with how sports worked in general, so when Cole gestured about the locker room or said, "Moments like these are intense as the playoffs, man," those just flew completely over my head at the time. But now that I've gotten a little older myself and have found excitement in sports like basketball, I can finally understand these references that Cole jokes about, and I finally appreciate them. I bet one of the reasons they feel so impactful is 100% the fact that Lester Spite actually played college football in real life. I feel like him actually being in a similar environment to the thrashball setting actually helps him embody the role of Cole Train, and his voice acting does more than enough to back up that statement. Delta Squad isn't the only COG team that experiences casualties, though. Sooner or later, Cole stumbles upon the remains of Rojas. He's an Alpha Squad teammate of Cole's that never gets any screen time in the actual games, but does play a very significant role in the comics and more narrative-driven books. And the worst part about this discovery is that Cole now has to break this news to the only teammate he has left, and his best friend. Damon Baird, voiced by Fred Tesori, is the last remaining member of Alpha Squadron we get to meet, and coincidentally the last member of the main cast we're introduced to. With Baird, the team originally thought it would be cool to make him a professional snowboarder with a chill, laid-back kind of personality. As I'm sure everyone knows, though, this idea was scrapped, and Baird's new gimmick is that he's a spoiled rich kid with a knack for hacking and engineering, leaving Cole the one granted the athlete archetype. Baird's specialities are mainly used for gameplay mechanics and scenarios like defending him while he repairs a vehicle, or by finding buttons and valves to turn while he and Jack rip open a door, or something to that nature. This meant Baird would have a new shiny pair of shoes to fill in order to stand out from the cast, so to speak. He quickly became the foil of the group, basically required to have a different personality altogether. The Baird we've come to know and love today is just as much as an entitled cynic as he is a sarcastic bastard, and he even gets his own game in the franchise later on, with Cole by his side. Yes, he's undoubtedly an asshole, but if his humor gets a chance to grow on you, he'll become a lovable kind of asshole. That's one of the main things that Rod Ferguson intended to achieve when creating the character, and he's went on record to say he was happy he got to see Baird flourish as much as he did. One of the other points of interest focused on was his relationship with his teammate Cole. Even though they are two bipolar opposites in nature, they still have emotional parts to their storytelling. Like, for instance, Cole is the only person out of the main cast who ever addresses Baird by his first name, Damon. He also overlooks all of Baird's witty remarks and quips because deep down, he knows they're just a defense mechanism for an insecure man during rough times. And just, wow, wait a minute. It's little shit like that that makes these games feel so deep and profound while also leaving room for action and combat to take a more significant role. Shortly after regrouping and thinking the job's almost done, another attack is waged on your location, and this time you get to see the game's main big bad guy, General Rom. When the King Raven descends upon the group in its fiery crash, it separates the main group from Lieutenant Kim, basically signaling his demise. Amidst the chaos, he doesn't notice Rom approaching him from behind and gets taken out in a memorable cinematic fashion. Without a doubt, it also manages to group the four personalities and make them work together to find a new way out of the mess they're in. And to make things that much worse, they now have to face a whole new enemy type right before they're clear of the mess. The Berserker is a fierce, ugly opponent that will require more unique approaches to take it down. These enemies will keep making appearances and evolving throughout the series, and in my opinion, they only get cooler and more badass the more you encounter them. Every Berserker you'll see is female, blonde, screams like a banshee the whole fight, and uses her sense of smell and sound to pinpoint your exact location. And they're pretty damn good at doing that too. Those are just a few fun facts really though. The most important thing, in the interesting part, is their armor-like skin. Their skin is so tough that standard weapons like the Lancer won't affect it at all. Only something as powerful as the Hammer of Dawn can take it down. Now, the Hammer of Dawn is a gun technically, but all the gun part does is signal the targeting location so a big flaming laser beam can shoot down from the COG satellites stationed in orbit. The only flaw with this weapon is that it is rendered useless when you're not directly in range of a satellite. And get this, you only have minutes of said satellite range left, so you gotta act fast to take this sucker out. After handling that, Barrett and Cole get regrouped into Delta alongside Marcus and Dom, with their new task of deploying the resonator inside Lithia Emulsion Facility, a nearby emulsion mine. Emulsion is Gears of War's fancy form of fossil fuel that has to be harvested much to the likes of oil, like in the real world. Except oil is good for gas mainly. Emulsion is a type of superfuel that has properties of oil, like how much money it's worth.
Hey, Marcus, how much do you think all that emulsion's worth? I don't think I can count that high.
But can also work well enough to power COG machines, vehicles, and even cities all on its own, basically acting as coal, oil, and electricity all in one. So just like oil in the real world, it quickly became the foundation of Sera's economy, and as the series progresses, the true nature of emulsion and its effects on both the environment and living organisms becomes a crucial aspect of the conflict between humanity and the Locust Horde. The exploitation of emulsion leads to catastrophic consequences, triggering events that have profound impacts on the fate of Sera and its inhabitants. But right now, nobody knows all that. All we know is that our mission is to plant this bomb at the bottom of this emulsion mine and get the fuck out. While on the way to the mine, though, you'll find yourself traversing through all kinds of devastation and crumbled buildings along the way. Behind the mask of chainsaw guns and orbital laser beams, there's a deep sadness in the wake of all the chaos in Gears of War. Sure, the Hammer of Dawn is a badass weapon, but you also must accept the fact that millions of innocent civilians lost their lives, and most of those times someone decided to casually press a button and drop the hammer. In case you didn't already know, when the COG first encountered the Locust, they didn't fully understand their enemy. And that, combined with the fear of them taking over COG-controlled cities, didn't mix very well. So, the COG decided to use a type of guerrilla warfare never before seen to try and stop the Locust. They deployed the Hammer of Dawn in a few vastly populated cities with the intent of, well, if we don't have any cities left standing, they can't take them from us now, can they, huh? Yet again, the COG are victorious and we've thought outside the box, ha ha ha. What this actually did was inadvertently turn the remaining civilians against their government, against the COG altogether. Some even choosing to live in key areas where the hammer first hit originally. Most of them, however, live in what's left of the destroyed office buildings and gas stations scattered around Sera's now newly developed Commonwealth. Act 2 does a great job of introducing this love-hate relationship too, in my opinion. At some point, Dom brags to the group that he knows a faster way to the mine, but we gotta trust him. Where he takes us is a dirty, rusty, and hidden society that consists of Sera's civilians, or what you used to call them civilians. They like to call themselves stranded now. The stranded and the cog despise each other for different reasons. The cog feels like the stranded are being selfish by deciding to sit around and not help them fight for humanity. And the stranded aren't too keen on enlisting to fight for a government that didn't think twice about sacrificing a few million of them in attempts to end a war. I feel like this dynamic has a little bit more weight to it compared to tropes in other video games, because I can really understand and rationally agree with both sides of this conflicting narrative. If I was out there, fighting for my life and watching my fellow Gears perish, I would want every other human out there helping me, because if we lose the fight, we're extinct, game over. But, on the opposing hand, if I was a civilian and then all of a sudden everyone I knew and loved died to a nuke-like device the government dropped with only a small chance of it actually working, I probably wouldn't feel so justified to pick up a gun and help out around the battlefield either, even if that battlefield was once a thriving city I called my home. Dom cashes in a favor and secures the team a vehicle. The only catch is we have to go get it ourselves. Normally, this wouldn't be an issue, but now it's officially nighttime. It was teased earlier a tiny bit by Baird after the first Berserker encounter, but basically, whenever it's dark enough outside, these vampire demon bats come out and they're called the Crew. They will completely eviscerate anyone who isn't surrounded by a light source. This is a very clear gameplay mechanic, and clever. It limits the player's movements without going as far as doing something huge like changing the controls altogether just for this one act. It also happens to showcase the importance of small things like lighting the devs are willing to use to create unique gameplay segments, and I can't really recall many games trying to pull something like this off, especially any in the shooter categories. Chris Perna, the future art director of Gears of War, went on record to say he's a very big lighting guy in that retrospective I mentioned earlier. So, when he also got a chance to help design a few levels for the first game, he was very adamant about the importance of lighting and how other developers/level designers could use this as a tool of some kind to make new challenges for the players. These hopeful thoughts and concept ideas eventually evolved into the pushable cars and propane tanks you must shoot to cast a flame bright enough to light your path, and we even get to see them again at the dark abandoned house you have to pass through. On paper, you're not doing anything other than just walking through rooms of an abandoned house, but the twist is you have to wait until the jackass outside turns the lights on in specific rooms so you're able to walk through and the krill won't get you. This type of gameplay mechanic is unique to say the least, but I think it also does a good job of keeping the player grounded in the current section. Every checkpoint you make it to is filled with the deaths of random people who failed to stay in the light, further incentivizing you to stay frosty, because just one wrong step in any dark crevice results in a full death. The game also takes this time that you're on your toes to drop dialogue on you, so that all the characters can further establish their bond. As clever as it all is, I don't think it's artful enough to fill an entire act with this stuff, though. Thankfully, the devs had the same idea as me, and that's why the last part of the game has you driving a big fuck-off APC through the destroyed city to save your friends. The driving parts of Gears games normally tend to fall on deaf ears or go unremembered to most of the fans of the series, but I actually like them for what they're worth because I can see them as the devs intended them to be. And that's something big enough and fun enough to grasp your attention for a little bit, but the novelty can wear off pretty fast, so thankfully they don't last that long. It's mainly here to disrupt the traditional gameplay loop just long enough so that continuously progressing through the game doesn't feel repetitive or too boring. The car itself has a lot of quarrels with many players, but it does its job one way or another, and eventually the gang makes it to the Emulsion Factory. Act 3 is titled Belly of the Beast because that's what you're walking into, coincidentally. At some point when you're on an old mining elevator, Dom mentions that the people of Sarah haven't actually been underground in years due to the ongoing war, and he doesn't like that we're about to be the first to break that record. Before the Locust War, humans installed mines underneath the surface of the planet to harvest emulsion, and since the Locust like to tunnel underground while invading, it just made sense to block them off and forget they ever existed. Act 3 uses this information of walking into the unknown against you while also leaning into the horror aspect of the series more than most chapters. When first arriving to the facility, Lambent wrenches are introduced, and if you're wondering why they're Lambent, or what's making them turn Lambent, you'll have to wait until the third game for an explanation. But for now, just know they're an interesting enemy to encounter, and to say the least, very tough on higher difficulties. Making your way through the facility will result in you entering the minecart control room. In here, you'll have to get inside a minecart and experience a new kind of minigame. While in the cart, the player has cover 100% of the time, so the challenge comes when enemies try to enter said cart, or when you encounter one on the scripted path. Nothing too hard to accomplish, and honestly, nothing of notable value even happens while you're in this minigame, apart from witnessing some cool abandoned oil factory type of aesthetics. But I still think it's kind of neat the devs were so comfortable with putting a small segment into almost every chapter so that you're not just constantly doing the same thing over and over. Just like the streetlight minigame in the previous act, this minecart segment does a good job of mixing up the gameplay flow, just enough so you can continue playing without feeling super bored. Needless to say, however, Delta Squad is successful in making their way into the underground. Once the gang is down there long enough, a corpser rears its ugly head. It was teased earlier in the story, but now it's actually time to face it. The boss fight itself is more of a gimmick than it is challenging, but the corpsers themselves do eventually get fleshed out and expanded upon as the franchise progresses. After watching this disgusting creature suffer a dramatic fate, it's safe to say you're into the endgame now. And to further establish this, literally right after this encounter, you run into Theron guards. Therons are vastly more intelligent than drones and can be easily recognized apart from other locusts. They wear heavy body armor that covers more of the upper body than drone armor, and a long leather-like strip of material hanging from the back of their waist that trails behind them and gives more of the impression of a scaly trench coat combined with armor. Many wear distinctive-looking helmets as well, often heavily embellished. Theron armor is laced with bright red flecks, presumably to give them more of an imposing appearance. Their voices are sibilant and with a definitive whispering hiss. They also carry the torque bow, which Cliffy B thinks is another revolutionary invention of his that deserves just as much credit as the Lancer. But I'm here to tell you it's essentially just a lousy bow fitted with some explosive arrows. I'll say this. Not many games had very many explosive bows implemented into them successfully at the time, especially in multiplayer games, but I can see why. Those arrows are also one-hit kill most of the time, no matter where they land on you or your opponent. So good luck, and I mean I wish you some tremendously good fucking luck when it comes to dealing with these suckers, especially on insane difficulty or heaven forbid a multiplayer game. I could not count how many times I died or my run was cut short by one half-ass shot by some cracked-ass AI. I'll give credit where credit is due, like the case with the Lancer, but this bow just feels like cheaper than any other gun in the game, and extra cheap for high-level enemies to spawn with right off the bat. So, sorry Cliff, I don't think the torque bow is yet another gun that redefines gaming. I mean, if anything, Hawkeye and Green Arrow have had this in their arsenal since the 1960s. I think sometimes Cliff's ego can really branch out of its respected zone and he'll say something wild, but I'm sure he means well at the end of the day. Either way, on the bright side, Delta Squad managed to deploy the Resonator and complete the mission. Only to be let down almost immediately after returning to the surface. Although you did successfully deploy the Resonator, unfortunately, the device itself couldn't map the Locust tunnels as efficiently as planned. It's almost like the COG had a general idea of what they should do when assessing the Locust threat, but executed their attempts poorly time and time again. This is kind of a foreshadowing, in other words, of things to come. Things I'll mention when they appear more clearly later in the story. But thanks to Baird's hacking skills, though, he was coincidentally able to find just about all the information you were lacking on those tunnels, and you'll never guess where he found this mysterious information. Act 4 is only possible thanks to Adam Phoenix, the father of Player 1. From the device Baird stole before the Resonator went off, He was able to find some files from Adam Phoenix that suggest the crust of Sarah is riddled with these tunnels, and you're supposed to get the impression that the COG actually knew far less about the Locust Horde than originally imagined. The twist rather in this chapter is that the information you're looking for is stored in Marcus's childhood home on Adam Phoenix's personal computer, unknowingly to him and the rest of humanity. When you set out for the Phoenix homestead, you'll eventually run into the second Berserker. This one is a little bit more rambunctious than the last one, but by this time in the game, you're supposed to have enough self-confidence to correctly deal with the situation without it taking too long. The narrative doesn't start to pick back up again until you make your way to the Phoenix estate. In the official book, it says that the Adam Phoenix estate was completed early on in development mainly for press demos, with a mission featuring a fight up the grand outdoor staircase. That mission is now. The reason we're here story-wise, though, is so that Delta Squad can manually download all those files Baird found earlier. One segment of that scene that tends to get overlooked, though, but it does explain the reasoning behind all the fighting you walk into, is the part where General Rom uses a COG helmet from a captured soldier in order to listen into enemy communications. Not only is this how he got to know the importance of the Phoenix domain, but this is exactly how he baited you earlier in the story when you lost Lieutenant Kim. Fighting is only a portion of the battle, really. Positioning and strategy can be just as effective in your approach if used correctly. The voice line that got played by Queen Mira earlier in the story when Kim was killed is talking about a snake losing its head and watching the body die, yes. But if you look deeper into the context of the situation, you can understand and analyze what the Queen is referring to, and that is all the previous times Rom has done this before. Killing the commander in a COG squad is a symbolism of the snake losing its head, and watching as the other soldiers scramble in fear until they meet their opposing doom is the same as the body of the snake that fights effortlessly before perishing. Rom may look dumber than a sack of rocks, but actions like this proves why he holds the rank of general, and justifies him for being the final boss of the game. He's just as smart as he is a brute. Despite his efforts, however, Delta Squad manages to attain the information needed and escape before learning the details of Rom's new plan. Act 5 has you try and board a COG train carrying the Light Mass Bomb. The Light Mass Bomb is a device supposedly strong enough to end the 14-year Locust War, and it's only operational thanks to the information the COG gained from Adam Phoenix's research. The bad part is that Rom is also aware of this catastrophic bomb and is sending everything the Locust have at the train in order to stop you from detonating it, including the third and final Berserker. Gears of War seamlessly incorporates familiar cinematic tropes into the actual gameplay without saying a word, evident in its deliberate utilization of the Rule of Three within the storyline, warranting noteworthy attention for its execution. The Rule of Three appears in Gears of War as the form of the various Berserker encounters dealt with throughout the game. The first one comes at the team when they are at their weakest, when the main goal is survival, forcing them to bond together as a unit, at the same time the player is getting to know everyone. The second Berserker is more of an obstacle than anything. You're expected to handle this situation a bit faster than before, and it doesn't really get a lot of dialogue dedicated to its showdown. The third and final Berserker, though, combines both of the previous scenarios and forces you to find a new solution to take it down after the hammer is rolled out. The Berserker itself is a unique kind of enemy, really, because it's not difficult enough to be classified as a boss fight, but it's also not easy enough for players to deal with for the developers to justify putting one in every single level. Meaning the three that you do end up seeing throughout the course of the main campaign get enough time dedicated to each encounter that they all feel distinctive. Meanwhile, nothing besides the setting and environment changes between them mainly. Tiny details like that only ever get noticed by super skeptics like me, but I think it's important to acknowledge them because if you remember, Gears of War was pitched to be a cinematic co-op shooter game originally, and these are key examples of the developers over at Epic stepping out of their comfort zones and approaching the game with cinematic intent, which is something the company wasn't very well known for back in 2005. You have to keep in mind this is around the time of prime Unreal Tournament. The train itself is the only part of the game that doesn't gel well with the rest of the portions included, but there's a reason for that. In the official book, it says when Gears of War was still an ambitious idea on a sticky note in one of the offices at Epic, one of the first concepts that came to light was a drivable train. The train itself belonged to the open-world hub-based design they had originally planned for the game, but thankfully that whole idea was replaced and the linear campaign we know and love today got to shine. And lucky enough, the train was even able to get reused entirely, while at the same time giving level designers a whole new opportunity to show off some excellent vistas and backdrops. The ink that's being produced from the Nemesis floats menacingly in the skies throughout the final act, staying noticeable in the player's view meanwhile telephone poles and water towers are whizzing by. And I gotta say, that shit is just beautiful, man. After enough fighting through the enemy-filled train cars and feasting your eyes upon the beautiful ink-filled skies, you'll eventually find General Rom, just in time for the final boss fight. Rom has the hitbox of any boomer model and a health pool the size of Texas, and that's being generous. Seriously, even on the easiest difficulty, it can take upwards to 5 to 10 minutes of continuous gunfire to take him down. And on Insane, it damn near feels impossible at times, especially when playing solo. Once Rom is defeated, however, the Lightmass bomb is deployed by Marcus, just before he dramatically jumps onto the chopper where he and Hoffman share a special moment of eye contact. In the official book, it says that the campaign was originally designed to be a kind of redemption story for Marcus, and in some ways it still is. But the book makes it out to sound like something else was planned to happen here, to give him some kind of extra validation. Instead, something was changed somewhere, and all we get now is this head nod essentially from Hoffman, and nothing else is said about it until the novel entries. More importantly, though, thanks to Marcus, Dom, and everyone who fought alongside them, humanity is safe for another sunrise to see another day. The final cutscene ends with Dom eager for tomorrow, followed by a speech from Hoffman informing humanity of the COG's success and Locust defeat. Almost immediately after that, though, we get to hear another statement from Queen Mira.
They do not understand. They do not know why we wage this war. Why we cannot stop. Will not stop. Why we will fight and fight and fight. Until we win. Or we die. And we are not dead yet.
This is one of the only other times we get to hear her in the game, and here she says something that you, the players, are meant to take and chew on for a bit. Her speech comes off completely different than Hoffman's, as she goes as far as to claim the COG may have won the battle, but they misunderstood the war itself. Which is a fair statement considering nobody ever really questions why the Locusts are invading during the runtime of the entire story. Needless to say, ending the narration on a mini cliffhanger was a bold move to say the least, considering the game hasn't established a surefire fanbase yet, let alone the green light for a sequel of any kind at the time. But luckily though, everything planned out for Cliffy B and Microsoft and Epic Games, and Gears of War went on to be one of the best-selling games of 2006. Gears of War quickly became a commercial success, selling over 3 million copies within 10 weeks of its launch. It quickly climbed in sales, becoming the fastest-selling video game in 2006 and holding a separate record for second most played video game on Xbox Live for the year of 2007, first being Halo 3, of course. One of the main reasons Gears of War sold as many copies as it did was no doubt thanks to the effort Microsoft contributed in the marketing field, inevitably producing one of the greatest video game trailers ever released in the process. Most mature video game marketing nowadays tries to showcase their game as if it were in a movie to try and draw in some new customers and appease new audiences. Sure, this strategy is commonplace now, but I genuinely don't think this type of tactic would have picked up and caught as much wind as it did if it wasn't for this one specific trailer released back in October of 2006. The trailer I'm referring to is the iconic Mad World teaser that dropped just a bit before the game was set to officially release. Microsoft reached out and pitched the idea to 215 McCann Studios, which happens to be an advertisement agency based in San Francisco, to which they agreed and history was made. 215 McCann was responsible for some of the initial jump-in advertisements Xbox used to push the Xbox 360, and have even collaborated with other big corporations like Coca-Cola in the past. Scott Dutchin was the chief creative office at the time, and even played a crucial role himself in modeling the trailer to fit Microsoft's cinematic narrative, to which he later stated himself that he was just following the trend everyone else was doing at the time, which was showcase the greatest parts of the world, characters, and weapons that the game has to offer in a heavily edited, short montage format with some dramatic music in the background. The idea of what song to use for the video supposedly came to Dutchin on his way home from work, as he stated in the book. Quote, "The original idea for the spot came to me while driving from work and crossing the Golden Gate Bridge on a dreary evening. We had all been talking about the game and the brief and how insane the weapon, monsters, and just the world of Sarah all was. I'd never seen a world in a game like that before, and I was just skipping through my music and Mad World started to play. At that point, I knew this track would work with what I thought the tone of the game was." End quote. It also just so happened to be a total coincidence that Dutchin picked the same song Cliffy B grew a personal connection to while developing the game, and it made for a neat enough fact for me to include it in this script. This trailer went on to be played nationwide, somehow breaking the non-gamer test, maybe with the help of YouTube starting to catch fire around the time, but it seemed like everyone stopped to watch this magnificent work of art, including myself. With the overwhelming success of this teaser trailer and Gears itself, Microsoft further established a partnership with 215 McCann, which would come to yield some very memorable ads for the platform in the future, those being the Believe and Deliver Hope advertisements for the Halo franchise in the coming years, making Gears of War, in a way, Epic taking a leap of faith and pursuing a project purely out of passion and vision over all else, and it actually succeeding. And I guess you could say that leap of faith paid off, because nearly 9 years later, Microsoft would go on to purchase the IP from Epic Games in order to produce a remake of one of their keys to success in celebration of the newest console. Fast forward a few years down the Gears of War road, and by 2012, the franchise had blossomed into a critical success, all the while Cliff Bleszinski was starting to grow some sort of disdain towards developing video games. Specifically, AAA retail games. In a Polygon article from 2013, Cliff stated that Epic Games was planning on taking a shift in company vision in order to start developing living product games, opposed to artistically designed box games. Essentially, Epic Games realized they could make a ton of profit from a game that never ends and has consistent updates and, in theory, is maybe free to play so that everyone can try it out. Sprinkle in a few brand deals and collaborations later down the line, and voila, you have Fortnite. Cliff wasn't the only one that wasn't happy with this decision, as Adrian Chimalares and Rod Ferguson both went their separate ways with Epic as well after hearing this news, as Adrian also expresses in a quote from that same article. Quote, "We, the devs, had plans of our own, plans that were incompatible with what Epic wanted to do. There was only one way out of that, and the solution was very simple. So we shook hands and parted ways." End quote. And just to make things clear, in that same piece, Adrian says that he doesn't think there's anything wrong with the decision Epic made, and he doesn't hate live service games either. But he and a few others just didn't personally think they wanted to pursue that type of ambitious project as developers, and that's completely fair and understandable. Cliff, on the other hand, felt jaded towards the direction the industry was headed in general and decided to retire from game developing altogether in 2012 for a short time. He eventually came back around to it, but his return wasn't met with the enthusiasm he was probably expecting, but that's a story for another video. All this commotion over at the Epic House made Microsoft feel like that worried neighbor that's one more loud outburst away from calling the cops to file a noise complaint. At some point or another, Microsoft had decided it was best to just straight up purchase the Gears of War IP itself from Epic, as they feared they couldn't risk losing one of their console's most cherished franchises. I'm not sure what made Microsoft jump the gun and buy the whole IP, but if I had to make a guess, I'd say 343 Industries fumbling the Halo Master Chief Collection's launch definitely had a horse in that race. Funny enough, Rod Ferguson was given the task of overseeing the production of the remake of the original game he helped polish all the way back in 2006, and this time he was going to be working with Black Tusk Studios to get it done. Eventually, though, Rod and his new fellow developers made a pact to make this project an exploratory effort, rather than a revolutionary effort. And to seal the deal, they decided to rebrand their company to the name of the Coalition. That's the name of the in-game pact of governments that dictates the land, also known as the COG. The decision was interesting to say the least, and shows how much enthusiasm some of the people who worked on these games really had for them, and still do, I'm sure. As heartwarming as it all is, though, it definitely came with some challenges, as Rod himself states in the official book. The Ultimate Edition of Gears had to be reconstructed from the ground up because the original game was built with the intent of showcasing the glorious 720p HD resolution that the Xbox 360 was capable of rendering across the 1 million pixels at once. But the Xbox One, on the other hand, could support as much as 2 million pixels per single image. So Rod and the team decided it would be much better to completely remake every texture and model rather than giving the existing assets an HD retexture. Which wasn't that bad of an idea in hindsight because it basically allowed everyone on the dev team to add another layer of polish to things thanks to the new tools granted to them with the advancements in technology since the original release. One notable area the remake shines in is the cutscenes. In the previous game, most, if not all, cutscenes were displayed live with the in-game engine, surprisingly well using a mix of mocap work and Epic perfectly utilizing the Unreal Engine. As outdated and demanding on software I'm sure that practice is nowadays, I can't lie, it does do a good job of making you feel like you're actually in the environment of the level, opposed to the heavily animated cinematic mini-movies the Ultimate Edition brings. And that's not me shitting on the Ultimate Edition cutscenes either, because they, like I said, could be classified as mini-movies themselves because of how well they are crafted and they don't deviate far from the originals whatsoever. I also wasn't kidding when I said a fresh new coat of polish was applied to the entire game, especially in the levels themselves. Missing person portraits were added throughout the cities, and they do a good job of setting something up for the sequel in the series. Sound design was another point of interest, and I can definitely notice the difference between games playing with headphones. Environments as well are always something developers pay close attention to. Even in the original game, you can find No Blood for Emulsion posters scattered around some areas that themselves are parodies of the real-world No Blood for Oil campaign that was established to try to convince the US to come back and bring their troops home during the historic height of the conflict in the Middle East. It's honestly very intriguing to me that Gears of War wanted to showcase the protest of war in a video game where you can chainsaw someone in half to save humanity. This narrative itself doesn't get explored fully until further in the franchise's storyline, but going back and looking at the series, it is nice to notice that Epic tried to do something like this as far back as the first game in the saga. And quickly before I forget, the Ultimate Edition does bring a few new quality of life things to the table. The Ultimate Edition also features a few new chapters to flesh out the final act that include some more Brumok encounters mixed with some grassy urban set pieces. Nothing memorable enough to write home about, but hey, they are nice bits of level design to say the least, and extra content if you only ever played the 360 version of the game. These sections weren't new to PC players, however, as these levels were actually featured in the original 2006 PC release of Gears of War, just not the Xbox 360 version. Some of the beloved Gears comics can even be unlocked in the main menu after you find enough CogTag collectibles, and that, I have to say, is a neat inclusion for the hardcore fans, while at the same time allowing newer fans of the franchise to digest some of that juicy Gears lore. The Ultimate Edition takes the classic Gears of War vibes and completely renovates them into this new experience that doesn't stray too far from the original by any means. I highly recommend you give it a try sometime if you haven't. One thing I never really considered thinking about when originally setting out to make a Gears of War video was the harsh realization that a collapsing civilization and society of this stature isn't that far from being feasible in the real world, and truth be told, it could happen any day. In 1983, Stanislav Petrov was lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces when the early warning satellite system he was monitoring detected what appeared to be 5 approaching U.S. nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles. Petrov was faced with a critical choice that had to be made immediately: treat the warning as a false alarm and risk a surprise attack from the U.S., or alert his superiors, who would likely launch a counterattack. Gracefully, Petrov chose a false alarm, later reasoning that he believed that if the US were to really start a nuclear war, they would most likely do so with more than just 5 missiles. And funny enough, he was correct. The satellites had mistaken the reflection from sun on clouds as attacking missiles. This crucial decision he made had him ridiculed at the time, but on the bright side of things, it would later go on to be proven that he undoubtedly prevented a nuclear war from breaking out between Russia and the United States in the midst of the Cold War. This landmark of a decision spared us a few more decades and further solidified Petrov as the man who saved the world. I bring all of this up in similitude to Gears of War because Gears also does a similar job of saying that individual soldiers disobeying orders can sometimes end up saving the world or preventing some kind of tragedy, all with the underline being that war is bad, of course. And listen, I'm not about to be the one who sits here from the comfort of my computer chair and pretends to know something that you don't and give some kind of lecture about how war is bad and how some aspects of it we're not all ready to talk about. But Gears of War is. And I think every now and then, a story like that is worth listening to. Thanks for watching. Hey, what's up? Good afternoon, everybody. This is Seth from SB Productions here. I just wanted to say, if you're still watching the video this far in, sincerely from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. I mean, this is my magnum opus so far on YouTube. I mean, I've sunk in countless hours upon like 6 or 7 months of editing and writing this video and gathering footage and all that. So, if you've just made it to this far in and you haven't even liked the video or anything like that, I really thank you and appreciate the time you took out of your day to watch this. It really means a lot to me, sincerely. And with that being said, if you noticed there were times that my voice, was very annoying or was kind of saliva-y, if that makes any sense, I want to apologize for that. I've been trying very hard to, declick my voice. I found a few programs out there that kinda help me more than most, but at the same time, I feel like my mix of my very wide tongue and Appalachian accent don't mix very well, if that makes any sense. So sometimes if you have some problems understanding what I say, I really apologize for that. I've learned some new techniques on pronunciation and stuff like that to further get rid of my clicking in my voice, but sometimes, like I said, the whole accent thing and the mix of my very poor pronunciation tend to overlap all of the progress that I've made. So, like I was saying, if it gets hard to understand at some point, I just appreciate you trying. You don't have to, lose sleep about it or anything. Don't worry about that. You could also feel free to leave any kind of constructive criticism comments down in the comment section below. I'm gonna try to read every comment. I don't get a lot, so, it won't be that hard. But, if you're actually saying some wisdom and spitting some facts, I will pay attention to it and, take your comment to value. But, if you're just gonna be some, hating on some hating bullshit or something, I'm a do take with that. And if you don't want to criticize me or, say anything rude or anything like that, you just appreciate the Gears franchise, why don't you leave a comment and just tell me how much it means to you? I mean, the Gears series means a lot to me, enough for me to make this 12,000 word essay about it. I mean, But you know, I loved doing this essay. I mean, this whole video was such a great experience to make. I hope at least one person out there can get the same amount of joy I got out of it back from it, you know? But, you know, I think that's all I have to say. Like I said, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. That really means a lot to me. You know, go on and subscribe. I have like a Red Dead video and a Minecraft video planned coming up. I don't want to say for sure yet, but, you know, subscribe, you know, stick around. We'll see what happens. And again, thank you so much for watching.